Hello and welcome to another episode of Polestar Global's SEAClearly Podcast. I'm Danny Rastelli and today I'm joined by Charles Ike, VP of Financial Markets and Compliance at Polestar Global, and David Tannenbaum, Director of Blackstone Compliance and a partner of Polestar Global's. Our topic for discussion today is, in my opinion, one of the most interesting ones available, AIS spoofing. So, Charles, I think the best place for us to start is diving into what is AIS spoofing, who does it, and why?
Okay, so it's worth actually defining what AIS is. So AIS stands for Automatic Identification System. It's actually designed as a ship-to-ship anti-collision system for vessels going in and out of ports and busy areas. The technology is you have a transceiver on a vessel and it's actually broadcasting the vessel's coordinates on an open radio frequency. And that can be received by land earth stations that receive that data and then plot it onto a map. And it can also be taken by satellites overhead as they orbit the area. Now, AIS has been widely used for vessel tracking since the sort of 2010s. It started off with terrestrial-based AIS tracking services that would be able to track vessels sort of from shore to 20 nautical miles out to sea. But then with the wide availability of satellite AIS, you then had sort of pretty much global coverage and the explosion of AIS providers all over the internet. Now, spoofing is when the signal from the vessel's AIS is manipulated. It could be done from actually on board the vessel, or it could be done remotely via a third party. And effectively, it is suggesting that the vessel is in a different location from where it actually is. And this is used to hide illicit activity. It could be for, hiding energy cargo. It could be for hiding illegal fishing for various purposes. So threat actors use that in order to obfuscate their actual activity and suggest that the vessel is, sometimes, doing an innocuous anchoring activity or something like that, where it's actually loading or discharging cargo of an illicit nature.
Yeah, just one thing to add on that, right, is that spoofing is not necessarily new, but it's become more prolific since the invasion of Russia, right? This has sort of led to this cottage industry of almost even creating devices for captains to spoof, right? That some of these are commercial off-the-shelf technologies where there's a button on their ECDIS chart, which is sort of their navigational chart, right? And they hit that, and all of a sudden it starts conducting the spoofing. I will say, though, that it has been around longer than we assume it has. It just hasn't been turbocharged. So my unit is obviously in charge of going through and detecting vessels that are engaged in spoofing, and we have access to certain leaked documents and information about Iran. And going back, we're seeing they've been doing it since 2020, right? It's just only recently on, say, a large scale and also on enforcement agencies' radars and stuff. So this is an old method, but it's now being turbocharged in a way that it was not in the past.
Yeah, that's right, David. So the threat actors have become a lot more sophisticated, and I think it's quite interesting that it coincided with the Russian oil price cap, right? And where the spoofing from other sanctions programs historically was a lot more basic. In fact, we were focused at the time more on AIS disablement rather than the creation of a fake signal. So yeah, it's been an interesting development.
Nothing like a state sponsor to help you develop what you need to do. But yeah, it's and our fear, right, is that it's going to start being used prolifically in other crimes as well. It's not just sanctions, piracy, illegal fishing, other forms of smuggling, and it just makes the seas less safe.
Absolutely.
So in saying that, obviously sanctions evasion and smuggling get the headlines, but how else? What's the unseen damage? How does AIS spoofing hurt the businesses and the coastal economies? What more is there when AIS spoofing happens that perhaps we don't really see immediately?
People will die. People will die. Whenever you mess with navigational information, and you pretend that a vessel is not in a location or that is in a different location, it makes the seas less safe, right? So we saw all the damage that the Dolly did when it ran into the Baltimore's Francis Scott Key Bridge, right? I live 30 minutes south of that. And that was a $3 billion disaster that killed 2 people. It also shut down Baltimore Harbor for a while. We consistently see spoofing. It used to be that they started doing it in like less traveled areas, like outside of anchorages. But we see people engage in spoofing literally pretending to be right next to an oil terminal. There's one oil terminal in Iraq, Khor al-Zubair. It's a narrow channel. It's like 400 meters wide. And every day we see spoofing incidents there where a vessel's pretending to be in the center of it. And all it takes is one captain or one first officer who's navigating into port, to make a mistake. And now they've crashed into a large oil terminal, potentially killing people, but also, say, shutting down Iraq's ability to export oil for 6 months, right? So this activity makes the seas less safe. A lot of the vessels that are doing this don't have proper insurance. In fact, there's entire insurance companies that are being created specifically to give insurance to vessels that are engaged in sanctions evasion. So they know they're not getting real insurance, right? They just want the veneer of legitimacy. And so it's more than just, hey, here's a compliance challenge that we're facing. Here's a safety of life at sea as well, right? That this could easily be a catastrophic disaster combined with an oil spill that kills people.
Yeah, thanks, David. And just to add to that, Danny, so while sanctions evasion obviously dominates the headlines, right? AIS spoofing creates a ripple effect of unseen but significant damage to legitimate businesses and even coastal economies, right? So for businesses that rely on vessel tracking data for trade, logistics, etc., spoofing erodes trust in that data, right? So, for example, commodity traders, shipping companies, they're operating based on, delivery schedules that's coming from, AIS data. If the vessel's location is falsified, it can result in costly delays, lost contracts, or even disrupted supply chains. And for the coastal communities, particularly those reliant on fishing, tourism, or port operations, spoofing, can obscure the illegal activities like unauthorized fishing or smuggling, hurting local economies. And for example, where a rogue vessel exploits spoofing to encroach on restricted waters, for fishing, legitimate fishermen face depleted stocks and unfair competition. And the port authorities may also unknowingly facilitate, sanctioned trade by not, keeping tabs on what's actually going on. So that obviously exposes them to legal risk and reputational harm. And ultimately, AI spoofing undermines transparency. It distorts market operations, weakens coastal livelihoods, and tools that detect and prevent spoofing don't just enforce compliance, they safeguard the integrity of global trade and the prosperity of local economies.
Right. Yeah. And in spoofing being designed essentially to deceive, how can technology like dark vessel detection, deep blue intelligence, David, reliably spot it? And what makes technology one of the only real effective ways to combat this?
Yeah, so I mean, there's 2 different types of spoofing that we typically categorize. One that we can detect by reviewing AIS information, and one that requires other sources, right? So, for instance, my team has 400 tankers that are spoofing, and we have the tracks and information from that. So when it comes down to information that we can analyze within the AIS, right, that there are certain markers that, and remember, each threat actor is different. It's different on how they actually upload the fake data. As Charles said, it can either be on board or also off board. And then you have ranging size and sophistication, that some of these guys just are amateurs, and there will be tells within the AIS data that it's clearly synthetic. And
Don't give it all away, David. All right.
yeah. And so we can take that information, right, and train it against sort of machine learning modules to detect this activity, right? And the bad guys are always going to be changing. So there's always this cat and mouse game where, we have to sample, hey, we know the vessels that are spoofing. How has it changed? So, a couple months ago, making these box patterns was all the hotness. Now we're seeing a lot of loop tracks, right? And so there's technology that can help that. And then the spoofing that happens off of it where the data looks genuine. So like if you want to get a very realistic track for spoofing, all you got to do is take a vessel's previous AIS history of like a voyage from, say, Dubai to China, and then copy and paste that and then change the timestamps and feed it through, right? So that's going to be very hard to detect. And so that's where we have to use other, I tell the marketing people, space-based and cyber-enabled means, right? But that's where satellite imagery comes in. That's where our ability to collect other electronic intelligence comes in. And it's also where our due diligence comes in, that if a tanker changes ownership rapidly, that's suspicious. So then we have a human that's knowledgeable about this looking at and being like, oh yeah, that guy's not picking up Omani oil. He's picking up Iranian oil right now. So there's no silver bullet, but it's always changing. But we talk a lot about how the bad guys are getting more sophisticated, but so are we at the same time.
Yeah. So David, is it safe to say that we've kind of adopted a risk-based approach, right? Where, we using, the company registry data, the flag data, etc. We try and identify the high-risk vessels and focus on those rather than, to use your quote from a previous webinar, boiling the ocean, right? Because, there's limited resource to be able to check all this information, even when you're using sophisticated technology.
Yeah, I mean, and that's where like Deep Blue comes in, right? Is that we do, and Charles, you've been in our resource planning meeting of, hey, this is what we need to focus on, right? This is the threat. I think there's also a large training component to it that, no, my team can't cover the world. And no, we're not going to get everything automatically because the bad guys will iterate and we have to catch up, right? But this is where training, say, since we're talking about sanctions compliance, this is where training compliance officers on what to look for is also helpful, right? Because then they become additional eyes and ears. When we're talking about local governments, it's building those partnerships and training with their maritime security component, whether that's their Coast Guard or something like that. So yeah, I mean, it has to be prioritized. And also, we just don't want to burden people with alert fatigue, right? Because that's the last thing you want is someone crying wolf 99 times a day, right? And then that 100th winds up being a true positive, but the person reviewing it's like, well, they weren't right the past 99 times. And so, yeah, I mean, it needs to also have sort of this everyone needs confidence in their own capabilities to sort of detect this as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. The reduction of false positives is so important to our customers in the commodity trading and the banking sector, right? Because, if you're taking a very sort of literal approach to, some of the guidance that's come from OFAC, right? Check for AIS gaps, look for ship-to-ship transfers. In the energy sector, all of that is, part of day-to-day operations, right? Vessels, transiting through certain areas will have AIS gaps. So you go through the Red Sea, they're going to turn off their AIS because they don't want the Houthi rebels firing rockets at them, all right? Or if they're going through the Gulf of Guinea, they don't want, pirates to come and attack the vessel. So it's actually good practice to turn off your AIS in certain situations. And then for ship-to-ship transfers, again, it's more about, has there been any attempt to hide the origin of the cargo, where they're trying to, destroy that link from where the cargo was originally loaded, and then, using, ship-to-ship transfers, from multiple vessels to then, hide the origin. So I think it's very important that, the software is actually, helping the banking and the commodity trading staff to do all the grunt work, right? And the last bit is, the Deep Blue intelligence from David's team is actually reviewing all these incidents and distinguishing between the low risk incidents and the ones of a genuine sort of threat nature.
Yeah, I mean, I think that highlights, because in the compliance industry, things are always maturing, right? OFAC is inevitably 2 years behind what's going on at any time, right? It took them a year to acknowledge that the dark fleet existed, right? And even longer to talk about spoofing. And so like that's part of why like we've also sort of developed this push model of certain things as well, right? That you have the tools that might alert it, you have the training, and then pushing this information out is that if you don't sort of live and breathe this, right? I can open up the map at any given time of the Persian Gulf and be like, he's spoofing, he's spoofing, he's spoofing, because that's my job. Your average compliance officer doesn't have that time, right? They are worried about what's going on with their institutions and, policies and procedures and stuff like that. And so that is where, like, I think the industry does need to sort of have a little chat with the regulators about when we can rely on third parties, right? And how much we can rely on it as well, because I think the world's getting more dangerous and it's requiring more specialized people to focus on a certain area, like we're on the maritime side, right? And I think that's something, the conversation we just need to have broadly with the compliance community.
So that's a very interesting answer to unpack, because you mentioned, for example, the governments, you mentioned OFAC and the regulators. In your opinion, both of your opinions, should governments and regulators be held more accountable and take on more responsibilities in combating spoofing? Or is this a fight that the private sector should lead to try and kind of get a handle on the situation?
Well, I think the regulators regulate, right? So, we already have, global regulatory authorities making strides in that area, right? So, but the reality is that stopping this type of illegal activities is complex. The landscape is forever evolving, and we already have regulations from the IMO, SOLAS mandate for AIS tracking. You have sanctions programs from the United Nations. You have sanctions programs from OFAC, from the EU. They all set clear legal frameworks. However, the enforcement is limited by resources, right? UN sanctions have to be implemented by UN member states, and not all of them have the resources to do that. OFAC has a bit more resource, but as David mentioned, there's a backlog of cases that they're reviewing. So the rogue actors exploit, these limitations, and they're using AIS spoofing, they're using identity tampering, complex ownership structures, and effectively evading evading detection. So this is where software is very important, right? So I guess companies like Polestar have taken it on and are helping not just the regulators, but the industry, right? The market. We have to remember that this is all about facilitating trade. People want to be able to trade safely, they want to be able to trade compliantly, and they want to be able to trade quickly, right? So by leveraging advanced technology, they're able to bridge that enforcement gap. So it gives businesses and financial institutions the real-time intelligence they need to detect deceptive shipping practices. And our software, for example, is automating vessel screening, sanctions checks, and risk assessments, and helping organizations to act quickly to avoid regulatory breaches and report things that they see, right? So I guess while the regulators set the rules, the private sector, companies like Polestar, we carry much of the operational burden, enabling the businesses to enforce their compliance proactively and maintain the integrity of their supply chain. So I guess the technology is a force multiplier in that respect.
Yeah. I mean, but there's also a little bit of you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink thing going on here, right? And we have to remember everyone has different priorities. So like OFAC is nominally in charge of US sanctions, right? Which is one use case for spoofing. I used to be at the agency. I can tell you wheels move slowly there, and they're starting to move a bit faster, particularly in the maritime space. But, it's not helpful when, say, you're a bank or you're a trading house and OFAC's not saying, hasn't started addressing it yet. They go to want someone and say, hey, here's this risk, right? Before a regulator even talks about it, right? That it's like they're, then senior management sitting there like, well, okay, we understand that's interesting, but we have all these other priorities. So until OFAC, issues an advisory on it, it's not going to be a high one, right? I think that there's other areas that local governments could do a better job policing their waters, right? That, they do have coast guards. They could go out and challenge some of these folks that are spoofing, either ones that are, say, illegally fishing in known areas, and make arrests for it, detain vessels, do a VBSS, or also just sort of try and clear up and provide notification to other people that there are no tracks there. I think the final thing is that, AIS is an old system. As Charles said at the beginning, it was from, I think, the 1970s, and it's a system of blind trust is what we call it, that you feed information into AIS, your transponder sends it to a receiver, and it doesn't interrogate the data to look if it's legitimate. It doesn't parse it to see if it looks synthetic. It just passes it on to an aggregator, right? And so there have been conversations we've been having with government, with the IMO, about, say, enhancing AIS to make it a bit more secure, right? To, say, attribute who is receiving the signal and providing this, right? And until all of that stuff happens at once, the problem's not going to be solved anytime soon, right? But to solve it fully, I think we do need to talk about moving on to a different standard of maritime tracking as well, right? That maybe this is no longer fit for purpose in all cases.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with that. I mean, AIS is being used, so widely now, but this was never the intention, right?
Yeah.
It was, port anti-collision, right? So, the proper way of tracking vessels, the way the vessel owners, flag registries track it, is via the Inmarsat or Iridium devices on there for the LRIT and SOLAS compliance. So, and now you have even more advanced technology, that's taking advantage of the fleet broadband, the internet on those vessels. So there are more accurate ways of tracking vessels. And yeah, it's the problem is that, getting things type approved at the IMO is quite lengthy. The IMO is effectively an arm of the United Nations. So you can imagine how difficult it can be to, type approve a new tracking technology. In fact, the Inmarsat technology, just to finish it, the Inmarsat technology uses the I3 constellation of satellites at Inmarsat, right? They've actually retired the I4 constellation. I think the I5 is probably approaching end of life, but the I3 is still in place because of the IMO conventions for LRIT and SOLAS, having that type approval. So the technology has moved on significantly, but the regulation is very slow. And David, you were at the IMO last week, right?
I was. And as a reminder, the Russians and the North Koreans and the Iranians and Cuba and Venezuela are all members of the IMO, and they were all present there, right? So not all IMO members may agree that they want to make this more secure because it helps their state-sponsored activities, right? But I mean, that's true. I wasn't going to call SATC out directly, but this does have real effects. That SATC is measured in kilobits per second, which means just getting information off a vessel is prohibitively expensive, right? That we have to sample where a vessel was once a day because that ping is like 25 cents, right? And it seems small, but when you realize that you could have thousands of rows of data every day, that's not cheap to follow a vessel, right? Moving to newer standards, data is a lot cheaper. We're talking megabits or gigabits per second, right? I think the other funny, I mean, it's not funny, but it's ironic that, the over-reliance now on AIS as well. The system was made to avoid collisions, and now with all the spoofing that's occurring and all the manipulation, and also remember, AIS is also vulnerable to cyber attacks too, right? That spoofing is essentially a form of cyber attack, but you could do a spoofing DDoS attack and make 1,000 vessels show up within a square mile, right? And so now there is the question that, is AIS actually making us less safe, right? And how can we improve it to get out of there, right? Is it actually working against its initial purpose?
Yeah, it's important to note that the vessels do not actually use AIS for their day-to-day operations, right? The shipping companies are using the appropriate technology, even if it is, even with the Inmarsat being a bit older, it is at least secure, right? So the positions are sent over a secure network, right? And it's not subject to the same manipulation as broadcasting the vessel's coordinates on an open radio frequency, which is what AIS does.
Yeah, I mean, but at the same time, navigators in the area will be getting their chart information that has AIS, right? So they're not necessarily getting the SAT-C positions of other vessels in their area, right?
Oh, yes, that absolutely.
Is apply safe, right? Is that ship owners can track what's going on, but the captain on looking off the bridge wing is getting a different picture than reality, essentially. So.
Okay. Firstly, thank you for the very exhaustive answer. I've been jotting down furiously keywords of everything that you've both been talking about. And really the things that stood out to me, I'll read you the keywords for context. Blind trust, complex, ever-evolving, expensive data, vulnerable to cyber attacks. And I'm going to ask you a loaded question here. Do you believe it's realistic to think that we can achieve complete transparency at sea at this point, or will AIS spoofing always be, as you put it, David, earlier, a game of cat and mouse?
I mean, complete omniscience of the ocean? No, like even the U.S. Navy tries that, but we are getting better, and there's a lot of really cool things that are happening within the industry. I think the standards need to be revised, both SAT-C to better terminals and AIS to a more secure form of it, right? And without that, no, like there will not be complete transparency at the sea. I do think that like imagery is getting better as well. There are some constellations that are going up that can image the entire world once a day. That tends to be a limitation for what we do, that a lot of the other big satellite companies, if you want to look at the open ocean, you have to task a satellite, and that's very expensive. And so there are all these cool tools that are coming online that can combine with this information, but I don't think that we will ever have true omniscience of the ocean. I think we can peel back a lot of the smoke, though, to see what's going on with concerted effort, right? Charles.
Yeah. So I guess what's happened over the last sort of 18 months is that, you've had portions of, the world's merchant fleet deciding that, okay, well, these vessels are a bit old. We're just going to use it for sanctioned business, right? And they're part of the dark fleet, and they kind of continue to operate in that world, right? But for the vessel owners and the vessels that want to be compliant, we've definitely seen an improvement in transparency, right? Yeah. And this goes all the way from owner operators, managers, to flag registries, etc., where because of the pace at which OFAC has been sanctioning vessels over the last 12 to 18 months, they are realizing that, okay, well, if my vessel doesn't have a very consistent trail of of movements via AIS, it's going to be very difficult for me to get my vessel chartered by any of the top customers from a chartering perspective, without mentioning names, the big oil traders, the big metal and mining companies, etc. They want to have a vessel that has very clear history, clear ownership, and no ambiguity or risk indicators. So we're seeing that improvement, and as these older vessels participating in the dark fleet eventually end up in a beach somewhere, being scrapped for metal, we're potentially in a more compliant world. I mean, but there's always the thing where the diligent operators will turn their back on business, will be seen as an opportunity for some of the smaller guys that do not think that they're under OFAC's radar to go into that business. But we've seen some of those guys being hit with sanctions, and all of a sudden, that vessel that you've borrowed, 40 million from the bank to finance is now unable to actually get any jobs. So the real life consequences of the sanctions are being realized. We've had situations where customers have had to forfeit cargo because their cargo's on board a vessel that's become sanctioned and the owner goes rogue. So the consequences and the risks are significant, and that's how the transparency sort of starts to grow, where they have no choice but to do the right thing. But it will probably take some time, and there will always still be threat actors.
I also think the world is sundered in half, right? That you have the Russia, Iran, maybe not Syria anymore, but, Venezuela axis, and where they've basically created their own fleet, right? That people are always stunned when I say that 10% of tanker tonnage is in the dark fleet. And that's not even counting sanctioned tankers like Sovcomflot, which would add more. So there's a lot of these vessels out there, and there's always going to be this demand for them as well, right? So as Charles said, like, big commodities traders, big banks, they want transparency. Good ship operators want it as well. And they're doing a lot of work to make it happen. And it's not cheap either, right? So they clearly care about this. But there's always going to be this pocket of the world that is going to be smuggling. They're going to be evading sanctions, right? And that's where we come in, to try and play the cat and mouse, that at least identify these vessels before, as Charles said, the nightmare scenario. You think getting a subpoena from OFAC is bad. Imagine what happens when you have to figure out that 150 million of oil that you just bought goes to waste, right?
And we're actually seeing a lot of cooperation from the shipping industry as well, where you have whistleblowers as well. And to give an example, we had a ship broker that was reporting the fact that another vessel that's been participating in the dark fleet was offering a very, very modest charter rate for a job. And he's like, this is throwing the market upside down. We can't have that, because he's got, a history of, making all these port calls in all these places that he shouldn't have. So in order to get, jobs, he's offering it at a far below market rate. And they're like, no, they're going to report this because, it's messing up the market. So, and that's not an isolated case. So, the drive for transparency will continue. But yeah, you'll always have, threat actors, and, as long as there's oil to lift in certain places, people will buy.
Yeah.
And in the spirit of advocating for transparency, and I think transparency is one of the most used words in this particular podcast, we've discussed the various players and their involvement in the success or failure of AIS spoofing litigation. But if you could, and as a final question I put to you, if you could challenge one group, be it governments, shipping companies, technology providers, regulators, or flag registries, to step up their effort in tackling AIS spoofing, which one would it be and why?
Well, I would say the challenge I would give to the regulators is to be more pragmatic with the guidance and the obligations that they're putting out there, right? So we have seen instances where they've had proposed things that would be beyond what a bank or a commodity trader could perform within a reasonable time frame, right? You have to bear in mind that the chartering of a vessel is a time critical activity, right? And you don't necessarily have time to ask for the birth certificate of the captain, for example.
Yeah.
But I think as they work a lot closer with technology companies like us, they can get a more realistic view of what can be done, right? So they're not asking people to confirm every ship-to-ship transfer via satellite imagery, or to have a photograph of the crew. And these are things that were actually suggested at some point, right? So, and I think we also need to have support in some of the markets where they don't necessarily have the same resources as OFAC, right? If you're going to have enforcement in some of these places, they're going to need some support. And the technology is available. We just need to get it in the hands of the right people.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of places where I'd start to make the sea safer. I think that, when it comes down to sanctions, banks have paid billions of dollars of fines, so they've invested heavily into compliance. Maritime service providers traditionally have never been hit by OFAC, right? There has been talk about designating a flag, which would scare people into compliance, but I'd say vessels don't set sail without three things. First, safety surveys from their class society. Second, insurance. And third, a flag, right? And to the degree that we can raise controls at any of those, then that narrows the possibility of where a vessel can be flagged, where a vessel can be insured, and stuff like that. And sort of using an ink block strategy, get them off the good flags, get them off the good insurers, and then now we know, hey, look, this flag, and we have flags that are problem children. We won't name them on this podcast, but every time they add a vessel to it, we take a look at that vessel. And so, pushing them out to these corners of the world at least gives us an area where we can kind of corral them and then figure out who is actually who, right? And so that's where I'd like to really improve controls, is with the flags and with the P&I as well, P&I clubs.
Well, thank you. This is definitely something I think we could talk about for hours, so we may even have to do a part 2 to this one because there's so much we haven't covered. I'd like to end in thanking you both for sharing your knowledge, your insights, and for your transparency. We've used that word many times, so why not use it one more time?
Yeah, and thank you, Danny, for being an excellent host and moderator.
Thank you.
And David, always a pleasure.
Always.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure. And of course, a special thank you to all our listeners. And hopefully this is yet another step towards helping you see clearly. Thank you very much and goodbye.